My name is Travis Ray Carter. I was born in the Gravel Springs community north of Bexar, Alabama, in Marion County on July the 17th, 1924. I was the seventh in line of the kids, and we lived there till I was 16 years old. My daddy had sawmills and farms. That was all people did in Marion County at the time. I turned 18 in 1942. At that time, they were taking people into the military 21 to 35. And at the end of 1942, they weren't getting enough men to go into the military, so they lowered the age to 18. When I got to be 18 on the 17th of July, I registered and got a letter the next day. They put me in draft class 1A, and they gave all the 18-year-olds deferment to finish high school. I graduated the 30th day of April, 1943. Got my greetings from President Roosevelt the first day of May, 1943. Every boy out of the class of Hamilton High School got their greetings. There was 46 from Marion County on the bus that took us to Fort McClellan. We stopped in Bell City. Most of us had never eaten in a restaurant, but we stopped there to feed us lunch that day. Then we went on to Fort McClellan. They went through and they looked at us. If you could walk, they nearly about took you. We trained 12 weeks at Camp Shelby and 12 weeks in Louisiana. Most of us didn't know what combat was at the time, but we learned. They told us we were part of the 512th Military Police. They told us we were going to be leading the Army wherever they went. We would be responsible for each unit. The entire Army would be governed by the MPs. We shipped over to Scotland in March of 1944. They took us to Truro, England. All the big brass was there. I didn't know there were so many generals and colonels and majors in the service. They announced that we were part of the Third Army. They was getting their ducks in a row to hit the beaches in France. We went down to Plymouth, England, the 2nd of June. And D-Day took place on the night of the 5th. My job was to help keep the First Army on the ships until they sailed, and nobody was permitted to get off the ship after they got on it. We stayed at Plymouth, I guess, 2 or 3, 4 weeks all told, and were being instructed all the time on what we would do when we hit the beaches. Then on the 1st of July, the Third Army loaded on the ship. We pulled out on the 4th of July. We got over to Normandy, and there were so many ships, so many folks in the water, storms were raging, and we stayed on that little old ship. We was on till the 14th day of July. Then we got out on land, and we walked about 10 or 12 miles close to St. Lo, France. That's whenever the Germans learned that the Third Army existed. There's lots of Germans killed at St. Lo. We left France December of 1944 and traveled to Belgium in trucks. The ice and snow was, I believe I could tell you, 18 to 20 inches deep. You wondered how you didn't freeze to death. Of course, my toes turned black as black could be. If we hadn't gotten to Belgium the day we did, Germany would have taken Bastogne, and that was one of the key parts of the war. We made the trip in less than 24 hours. A lot of it was at night with the lights off. Frankly, I don't know how we made it that far. It's close to 100 miles. Well then, the Third Army was directed to go to Germany. We crossed the Rhine River. Of course, we were moving pretty rapidly, miles a day, taking Germans. There was so much killing, so much awful weather. It was tough, of course. They got you or you got them. We were fortunate enough to come out ahead. We got to Weimar. It was one of their great cities, and they made all their ammunition and war materials, airplanes and such. We were coming up, approaching from the east. They announced that there was a prison camp there, Buchenwald. They were still trying to hold out. 3 days later, we had the camp surrounded by our troops. It was a big, big camp. Went through with the tank destroyers and the infantry, and they killed all the guards there. We let the prisoners do that. There was all these poor folks that they had worked them to death and gave them nothing to eat, hardly. Buchenwald was primarily slave laborers, and they made army equipment at Weimar. They got to where they couldn't work, they'd kill them. Burn them, throw them in the ditches. Supposedly 247,000 was killed at Buchenwald prison. Of course, we didn't have any idea what we were going to be seeing. You can't believe the odor and the death that was taking place. They still had men hanging on the walls, and they had 8 furnaces burning whenever we first got there. And they were burning them just as fast as they could. The people were so starved, and the thing was, a lot of them wanted a cigarette. They were too weak to eat anything. Of course, we were giving them all kind of food and supply. We gave them the guns and let them kill the Germans. My orders were to stop any German resistance it might be. There was about 150 to 200 guards, and They made themselves secure because they knew those prisoners would like to get them. We let them have them. Put it that way. It's awful to say, but it was a joy to see those guards die because they'd been so ruthless with the prisoners. People in the camp. Oh, Lordy. We were tending to the needs of the thousands of people that were sick and afflicted, and some of them couldn't even move. They were just starved to death. Our job was to be as good to them as we could. We carried lots of food, a lot of medical supplies. We made lots of the people at Weimar go out to Buchenwald. MPs took the citizens in truckloads at a time. They said they couldn't believe that something like this was going on this close to them. We believe some of them. But some of them, it was a made-up deal. It sure was. Some of them knew, but they wouldn't admit it. I don't sleep some nights. There's some nights I don't even go to bed. I try to put all the bad behind me, and I try to think of something good. And I try and never let a day pass that I haven't done something to make life just a little better for somebody in the world. I think it's because I've seen so many horrible things in the past that I like to remember the good. And there's good in everybody that can be brought out.
Friday night, April 13th, 1945. Hello, everybody. This isn't a regular letter. I have a story to tell you. Before I begin, let me advise you as follows. If you're bothered reading about unpleasant things, don't read this. I'm not much of a storyteller, but if ever I wanted to tell a story vividly enough to convey my visual and mental impressions, this is it. I'll begin this story by mentioning the town of Ohrdruf, Germany. You may or may not have heard or read about this town via radio or newspapers on or around the above date. If you had, then you know what I'm writing about. But you may have missed it in the anxious glance for the rapid advances on both fronts. Anyway, Ohrdruf was a small crowd town on the path to our advance. To casually run through it, it would look like any other small town that we've come through. But it wasn't. In this town, I saw a horror, the works of fiends. That's what I want to tell you about. If there's any part of this which challenges your reason, I'll forgive and understand your choice to doubt it. This is the time when you include the statement, you'd have to see it with your own eyes to believe it. I ask you to believe it. I'll take an oath and vow that all I write here now is the truth and what I saw. Today I saw a labor camp, or concentration camp, or extermination camp, all three apply, that the Nazis managed in the town of Ohrdruf. It is called Dachau. From the outside, when I got out of my Jeep, I saw little pine and spruce trees, which only partially hid double barbed wire fences about 9 feet high. As I passed through the gate, I noticed that between the barbed wire fences, there was a concertina, a rolling mass of barbed wire, about 3 feet high. This is so that if any poor soul was fortunate enough to mount the first 9-foot fence, he would fall into the rolling mass of barbed wire. And then he would have to try to climb the other 9-foot fence. Of course, all this he would have to attempt under the surveillance of the Gestapo with machine guns, who were posted outside the double fence, about 12 feet off the ground, with a commanding view of the whole camp. This fence I saw confined an area of about 400 square yards. For the most part, the interior of the camp is composed of one-story wooden shacks. Some shacks had rotted wooden floors, others had cement floors, and others were just plain earth. On these floors were rotten, soiled, spoiled cloth sacks of straw that were the beds of men. The sight of these alone, with their accompanying smell, was enough to turn your stomach. If you can possibly conjure up in your imagination an odor that would be a combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, decayed scraps of food, and stale air, you would be smelling the experience. Small pans that looked like a combination mess can and wash can were strewn about the floors. There were torn and battered clothes, worn and broken wood and cloth shoes scattered all over. And to top all this filth, the bad and the rotten, the stench of the dead filled your nostrils so that you wanted to give way to the muscles and retch. Not all the shacks had dead in them, but of the ones that did, the dead were shot through the head. They were dead because the Gestapo shot them as they lay asleep or too ill to move when the rapid advance of our army forced them to flee. From there, I passed on to a courtyard in the middle of these shacks where I witnessed something that made me gasp in horror and in distaste. I wanted to shake my head and say, no, I wasn't seeing right. Yet there it was. I saw shapes that were once men. Some of them were naked, some were half-clothed, some fully clothed. They all lay in different positions, mostly funny-like, twisted and turned, crumbled over unnatural. Some looked like they were resting on their heads, others with their arms and legs underneath them and twisted in all manners and shapes. These men had been shot through the head. They were kind of greenish looking men. But to all this was the added shock of their physical condition. You could easily tell that by the naked ones. If you can visualize a layer of a very thin cloth on a human skeleton, just to give it bare contour and shape, you'd have a good picture of what they looked like. Obviously, they were not fed enough to keep them alive. As I witnessed, when the rapid advance of our army made the Gestapo flee, they took all those that could walk or weren't sick with them. The rest of them that could fall out for a formation were shot as they formed. A survivor told the story that they were all called out and then told to bend over. The Gestapo then went around and applied the pistol to the head. And of course, the ones that couldn't fall out were shot where they lay in the shacks. If ever I felt sick over a sight, this was it. After the initial shock, I said what almost every other GI said: those dirty, low son of a bitches. I saw this about 4 or 5 days after it had happened. The bodies had already begun to spoil. In another area, several hundred yards away, there were rows and rows of still more remains that had been hastily sprinkled with lime prior to some kind of disposal. I couldn't quite decide what they were going to do with this batch of dead. I thought perhaps they meant to place them in a common grave. They got around to it. The day I came, the army had gathered up the male population of the town of Ohrdruf and brought them out to this area where they were all busily digging single graves for the dead there. I should estimate there were around 150 to 200 Aryan supermen digging graves. I enjoyed the thought of the terrified speculation in the minds of those citizens. I hope they thought they were digging their own graves. They didn't look like the flawless Aryan race then. Close by were 2 freshly killed Gestapo by some rightful strange twist of fate. They'd returned to the scene of their crimes, believing that their victims had either all been removed or were all dead. But fortunately, that was not so. There were a few prisoners who had escaped and were in the vicinity. What those few did to the 2 returning Gestapo should be the justice meted out to them all. And as I looked at their battered red bodies, one had virtually no face left, and the other had 6 holes in his chest, I felt only satisfaction and a feeling of gratitude that at least some of these bastards were paying a price. And even this was an easy out. I had one place left to see. About a mile away off the main road, though, through some plain open fields at the edge of some small woods, was some further evidence that these people had lost any claim to sanity. At first, I saw a black shadow against a green background. As I got closer, I saw the black took form and shape. It looked like burnt logs. Yes, it was burnt logs. But intermingled with them were charred legs, arms, and heads. First, they would lay parallel rows of railroad ties. Then they would lay logs and small branches across them. On top of this went bodies, and on top of them oil, and then they set fire to it all. I don't believe that I will ever forget what I saw and what I'm telling you about is mild in comparison to some other camps that my friends have seen. That there could be any camps worse than this makes me shake my head and wonder how it could be. But they have told me of torture chambers that would make your hair stand on end. That's the story. If I've made your stomach feel ill, then you have recaptured some of the nausea that I experienced. I hope you didn't mind hearing about what I saw. Much love.